Shen is a reporter at Protocol and co-founder of CN Storytellers, a community serving and elevating Chinese professionals in the global media industry. Welcome to China Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Clubhouse. Talk to me about your experience on the app.
It was early February. I started noticing there was an influx of Chinese users. Clubhouse talking about all kinds of different things. It was firstly most product managers and VC investors and tech workers talking about the product and how maybe whether Chinese tech companies can copy it and how can they execute it. And then, I was fascinated by the variety of conversations going on Clubhouse at the time. That was early February, definitely.
Sure. So we start from like product managers and end up at dissidents. What was that arc for you, and what were some of the more memorable conversations you overheard? I guess, is that the right verb? Overheard? What were some of the conversations?
I overheard.
What were some of the more interesting conversations you listened to that touched on some pretty sensitive topics?
Yeah, I was mostly lurking, and I think it was that weekend, first Saturday, the Uyghur weekend. There was this Uyghur room. A lot of dissidents, Han people, and Uyghur people overseas talked about their personal experiences and what their reaction to the massive human rights abuse in Xinjiang, and there was quite a few Han-splainers and CCP apologists, but that was I think it lasted for 9 hours, and I listened to the conversations for 9 hours. It was really exhausting, but I just couldn't stop listening to it. I was just captivated because you rarely hear this kind of conversations on Chinese social media. I knew there is a subgroup of liberal-leaning or even progressive Chinese web users who live on different cocoons on Chinese social media, but their voices are usually not heard because it's drawn out by the nationalistic voices. So I thought it was great for these people finally to have a space to express themselves and to talk amongst each other, to have this echo chamber for themselves, because it's so much needed. So that was my thought of the weekend before, the magic weekend before Clubhouse got banned in China, unfortunately.
And what about your reflections on the sort of like on the Taiwan, Hong Kong mainland groups?
I probably didn't spend as much time listening to those conversations as I did with the Uyghur rooms. I think the first few times I went into those rooms, I thought it was great that mainlanders and Hong Kongers and Taiwanese people were finally talking to each other, however different their viewpoints were. People were polite. They were like talking to each other, not fighting against each other. And because I never had this kind of experience before. But then I realized some of the rooms were just, a few times it was just all men talking about their experience and their political stands and their thoughts, and women couldn't even have a word in those rooms. And I was like, oh, this is not fun. Then I left quietly. That's my favorite button on Clubhouse.
It was, I think, on a Monday where it became much more difficult to join Clubhouse from the mainland. And what you were left with was a still odd, like a still lively, but, much different kind of mix of participants using the app in Mandarin. What have been some of the conversations that have struck out to you since that day came?
The Mandarin rooms have become less interesting after Clubhouse was banned in China, unfortunately, because I was addicted to Clubhouse for a week and then it got banned, and now I'm no longer addicted to Clubhouse, which is probably a great thing for health. And the interesting rooms after, there were a few parody rooms. That one room, hundreds of people were roasting Hu Xijin, was pretty funny. That shows it's really sad censors took action against Clubhouse users. But on the bright side, pervasive censorship breeds excellent humor dark humor.
Can you give China Talk listeners a taste of some of the...
I actually had problems following some of those speeches because they were really well crafted, but some of them spoke really fast. And I had trouble following those conversations, but overall, I think it was just so lively. And this shows the kind of the unfiltered, what it could have looked like. It looked like if the Chinese internet is unfiltered.
Yeah. Shen, if you think you had problems following the speeches, I feel like I'm really not the one to explain what the jokes are, but I'll give it a shot. Basically, Hu Xijin, the editor of the Global Times, which is a super right-wing nationalist newspaper, people were like pretending like they were his biggest fan and that he's like the leader of the future and we're all going to follow him into a happy socialist world where like China's number one and the US is licking China's feet or what have you. And people wrote these like it wasn't just a few people, it was like hundreds of people writing these very elaborate speeches, weaving in all of this like nationalism, and then just like the Chinese government speak, and you had the rhythm. It was like a scene like Xinwen Lianbo.
Right.
It was just very it was like this like outburst of creativity, which if you spend time on Billy or whatever, you see, but it directed in very different ways, right? Because this sort of making fun of someone for their like love of China is something that would never fly on the mainland.
Yeah, it reminds me of toad worshipping, which has been around for quite a few years. People have been doing the same with Jiang Zemin, but not vocally. And Hu Xijin, the next day, he even issued a response to the night-long roasting of him on Clubhouse. I thought he said something like, some people demand too much of freedom of speech, and realistically speaking, it's not something that can be achieved in China. Something like that.
Have you seen there's a show, it's 吐槽 something like
吐槽大会.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
Basically, like, this happens in China. Like, the Comedy Central roast is a thing that has been ported to the mainland, and people make fun of celebrities or live streamers or whatever. The level of, like, bitingness of these jokes is way toned down from what you would see of Martha Stewart making fun of Justin Bieber or whatever. But, yeah, it's really funny that... It's actually not at all surprising that Hu Xijin didn't enjoy himself getting made fun of. The other great part of that room is like every 10th person or something would not be in on the joke and be like, are you guys really making fun of him?
Yeah.
Or are you actually his fans? Should I start a new room? Because I actually like him and I'm not sure I feel comfortable here.
And the moderators would be just like, you can stay on and listen for a while and make your own judgment. We will go on this show for now.
Yeah, so that was a special thing, and hopefully more of those sorts of things can happen. One of your beats you've been covering for a few years now is feminism in China and the sort of feminist movement and its interaction between feminists within China and those living overseas. Can you maybe, I don't know, start the clock whenever you feel like, but tell the story of the past few years of what has and hasn't been able to be accomplished in pushing forward women's rights?
Yeah, so I started covering this issue since I became a journalist in early 2015. That was when the Feminist Five got arrested in China, and that was my first story. One of the first stories I did in China. And since then, I had been following the Feminist Five and their activist friends in China and outside of China. I find it quite fascinating that gender has basically become one of the most discussed social topics in Chinese social media over the years. It was not like that in 2015 or even earlier. I think that has a lot to do with the work that China's feminist activists and the scholars and researchers who worked for state-affiliated institutions, their push for more gender-friendly policies and their advocacy work on the street and on the internet since 2015 or even earlier, 2012 or even earlier. So what happened after 2015 was that the Chinese feminist activists could no longer go to the street and wear a bloodstained gown to attract attentions. They had to lay low since the Feminist Five got arrested, and a few of them have come abroad. Lu Ping and Liang Xiaomen, they are now in the U.S. and they have started to organize in the U.S. to connect with young Chinese students and Chinese professionals in the U.S. Just form a support network of feminists that can echo to what's going on in China. And I think this is a global trend. There are similar networks in the UK and elsewhere as well. So this is great. But then also on the other hand, Chinese women are having a more difficult time as the Chinese government comes down with harsher gender policies to push women to go back home, and the two-child policy, and women feel like they're increasingly having less liberty in China. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why now gender issue has become one of the most talked discussion on social media and in Chinese media as well. But maybe not so much in Chinese media.
The story of Xianzi is another one that you've been covering. Give the listeners a little background into what's been going on with her in her case.
Her story is important in a way that some people say it's her story brought out China's Me Too moment, because back in 2018, she was one of the women who publicly accused a male celebrity, a CCTV host, of sexually harassing her when she was an intern working on his program a few years back. The host's name is Zhu Jun. Zhu Jun actually accused Xianzi and Mai Shao, a friend who helped her spread the word online, for spreading rumors. But then Xianzi eventually sued Zhu Jun over sexual harassment, and this trial was heard last December in Beijing. What surprised me the most was that hundreds of people on that day, on the trial day, showed up outside of the local court to support her. They carried slogans. They say things like "Xianzi, we're with you," "Go Xianzi," and it was really moving day, I think, for me. I really wish that I had been there to cover the story. A lot of us who were not able to be there were just tweeting on Twitter, and there were a lot of pictures and videos circulating on Chinese media as well, but a lot of them eventually got deleted.
So in this environment, where does the movement go from here? You wrote a piece recently about sort of Billy and misogyny and women pressuring advertisers to pull their ads from Billy, which I thought was an interesting sort of echo of something that you've seen in the West of late with consumers leveraging advertisers to leverage change.
I think it's inspiring that feminism is not a word that women are shunning in China anymore. And it's fascinating that a social media group, it's called the Goose Group on Douban, are taking on Billy, a NASDAQ listed tech company, exercising their consumer rights to boycott such a giant tech company because they were discontent with what they call deeply misogynistic content. Billy bought and promoted a Japanese anime series called Jobless Reincarnation. A lot of women were offended because the show featured misogynist content that objectified women, and it also featured some pedophile elements. So the women's arguments were, Bilibili has become a mainstream video sharing platform. You have audience who are all ages. Some of your audience are minors even. You're not the quirky anime fan base that you started in 2009 anymore. So you have this social responsibility. You have to shoulder your social responsibility as a mainstream platform. That was the main argument of the feminists. But I think this incident highlights the tensions that have been percolating in China for the past few years, which is women are becoming increasingly aware of inequality that happens in workplace and in life and online. But then the government is increasingly pushing them back to home, back to the kitchen, and to have the second child. And so this Billy incident basically highlights this tension right there. And now that the tech company's position is also interesting. It wants to be on the government's good side. So users have seen quite a lot of nationalistic content on Billy in the past few years. And
come on, there was the Marx, like the anime of Marx's life as a angsty teenager, which I could only stomach 10 minutes of, but was one hell of a production, I thought.
Right. So the tech company has to be on the good side of the government, and so therefore they're pushing more conservative nationalistic content. But in the meantime, they are having more female users who are increasingly voicing their discontent. They call for inclusion and diversity. So I think that's an interesting trend that's going on. And I think even in China, no tech companies can afford to be called a misogynist platform. It's just not good. So I'd be curious to see how this kind of user boycott, how long they can go, basically.
Speaking of misogynist tech firms, you also recently wrote a piece about the experience of women at some of the largest tech firms in China.
Right.
What did you learn in reporting that piece?
What did I learn? So before I started reporting, I was thinking tech firms, maybe they do better than traditional companies in terms of treating women because they're tech firms, and I had this assumption or this question, would they be better? But then I found out they're not actually better than other sectors. I think one thing that's different than other firms is that there are more women working in the tech industry, and there are, in some firms, women actually hold leadership positions and quite high up in those companies. But then the female workers at the lower levels are still have to deal with a lot of sexism and sexual harassment. And this makes me thinking, in this those structural problems, it's not just a numbers game. It doesn't really help when there are maybe 40% of women in leadership roles. It's very sad.
Yeah, you also made this point about how even the senior folks who are females who've made it, they don't necessarily they have to play the man's
game.
They have to play the man's game even more aggressively than the guys to show that they're like with it, which is definitely a dynamic that you've seen in the West as well and in different corporate settings, which is
because that's how they enter the powerful circles. And this is another theme that I constantly heard from my sources, which is that some of the female managers do not like female employees. They like to lead male underlings, which to me was a sign that women are still so marginalized in those tech companies. There's just not so much solidarity there. And frankly, some of the women are not even aware that there is so much sexism and sexual harassment going on. A few people told me that their female or male bosses would delegate the young, good-looking women, to work with men on other people or to work with corporate partners. That was just mind-blowing to me. But some of them wasn't aware. They didn't think even it was a problem.
Yeah. The other aspect of this is the Jojo Liu lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And being a parent and working 6 days a week, maybe even sometimes 7 days a week for 12 plus hours a day is not functional, especially when you have young children. When I was at Kuaishou, there were a handful of people who had 2 houses, one near the office and the other like an hour away where their kids went to school and where their grandparents lived. Mm-hmm. And even in the highest earnings, most quote unquote made it section of society, you still have people who are just like sending their kids to live with their grandparents and not raising them themselves because of the structure of things, even with the Beijing hukou, right?
Yeah.
It was a really remarkable thing for me to realize this, the power of the corporations relative to the workers in this market, that they can demand that much out of their employees.
Because there is a lack of childcare support in China, like from whether the government or from the company. Women are basically shouldering the lion's share of the childcare work, and so what I found that women who are working at those tech giants, they're mostly single. They don't have families because basically they told me they don't have a life. It's not just 996 anymore. It's just I don't have a life. And quite a few told me that they were planning to quit in the next few years because it's not a sustainable lifestyle. And also there is another aspect of this is most women working in those technology companies are working on the human resources side, the operating side, the product side, but not many of them were software engineers, which were the powerful tech side of the company. So there is that, and it's just multi-faceted.
So I remember when I was working at Kuaishou, basically it's in a sort of like a office park where there were lots of other tech firms. Mm-hmm. And in CRT, there was a poster for Singles Day basically being like, hey, look, we're going to have a singles thing here. These 5 companies are going to be invited, all the ones that are within walking distance. And the joke was, it said on the poster, if you know, like, you're not going to date anyone who doesn't live right here anyways, because otherwise you'd never see them. So you might as well try to meet someone for Singles Day who works in the same industry, understands your hours, and lives like a 5-minute walk from you, which I just thought was like a little too on the nose. For just like describing the sort of pressures that you live under if you work at one of these firms.
Yeah, I guess the jobs in the tech industry is like the new public service job in China. The cachet it takes and the kind of best and brightest talents it attracts to the industry.
Sure. Let's talk about food for a second.
Okay.
So I hear you're a big gourmet. What has struck out to you? You said you want to talk a little bit about Chinese food ordering apps Chinese grocery apps in the US. What's notable about them?
There are Chinese food delivery apps and grocery delivery apps that I think created by tech firms based in the US, but were founded by Chinese immigrants, and those apps are also targeting the big number of Chinese immigrants in the U.S., especially on the East Coast and the West Coast. And so basically, there are a variety of Chinese food options on those apps that are not on, say, DoorDash or Grubhub, or some of them are not even big enough to be on Yelp. So I think that's definitely a gem that non-Chinese speakers are missing out in the U.S.
So which one of these apps are your favorite?
I use Hungry Panda for food delivery because I live near a Chinese-dominated neighborhood. It delivers the food that comes. The food that I order usually gets delivered within 30 minutes, and a lot of the food options there is a large number of Fujianese immigrants in this neighborhood, and so I get to eat a lot of authentic is a loaded word, but
let's just say good
local Fujian specialty that I quite frankly did not have much taste of it anywhere else in New York, so that's been really good. I also use this service called Yami. I think its English name is Yami Buy, YAMIBUY. This is where I buy most of my seasonings, condiments, dry foods. It has been around for quite a few years. It started basically when I was a student in the U.S., which was quite a few years ago. Yami has a lot of variety of options for Asian snacks, condiments, seasonings, dry foods. They also have a fresh a grocery delivery service, but I've never tried it. I most of the times I buy groceries from my own neighborhood stores.
Shenlu, you told me I can't use We anymore because they treat their employees poorly. So I will take one for the team and buy a fresh order delivery on Yamibuy and report back onto the quality of the produce there.
There is another grocery delivery app. It's called Fresh Go. Fresh Go is similar to We.
Talk a little about China storytellers.
Me and a few Chinese journalists friends, I think there was 10 of us, co-founded this Lose Collective in 2019. And it was initially just a few of us. We kept talking about the challenges and problems that we face working in the English language media industry, whether in China or out of China. Hopefully we can help other people to elevate their careers and amplify their voices, since we did not have that when we started out working in the media industry. 2 years later, we have a couple hundreds of members from all working from across the globe. We have a space on Slack where we share a lot of our work and our lives and our issues and our achievements. And then we have a public-facing newsletter facilitates conversations that people like us care a lot about, like the situation of Chinese journalists in China and outside of China when they work for global media, or things like what is home to people who have moved around in the past 10, what does home mean for people who have moved around in the past 10 years. We also have Twitter presence. I think we have more than 10,000 followers now, which everybody is excited about. We did not expect this to be attracting so much attention, because we don't have any financial support or revenue or anything. It's just like an organic thing that has been growing. So that's gratifying.
Shenlu, thank you so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a lovely conversation with you, Jordan.
太多没有时间，太忙，就算烦恼再多，我也很快乐。生活就是为了金钱，到处忙碌奔波挣脱。想你能够快乐，你能够快乐，你能够快乐。也想着你们每天这么努力，看到我们这么有出息，非常默契。讲出自己的想法都对，工作不分低贱高贵。相信自己的力量，相信自己的力量，相信自己的力量。学会去保护着的标准打碎，键盘交集的不去理会，坚持做自己就对，其他都无所谓。Baby， 偶尔你也会累，但别忘记还有梦相随。We are only in zone that we are。失落，偶尔也有困惑，也多，就算受过挫折，我也很洒脱。堕落，只是因为能够掩饰自己懦弱。Oh no， 想你能够振作，想你能够振作，想你能够振作。相信你们每天看到我们有人被骂吧 I don't give a shit， 相信自己的存在可贵，工作不分低贱高贵。相信自己的力量，相信自己的力量，相信自己的力量。不管我怎样去表现，他们还是讨厌；不管我怎样去解释，他们还是抵制。不如就算了吧，不如就算了吧，不如就算了吧。学会去保护着的标准打碎，键盘交集的不去理会，坚持做你自己就对，不做谁 baby。 我知道偶尔你也会累，但别忘记还有梦相随。我要未来自己才会。我还年轻， 信我有野心，他们说时光不能浪费，可我现在18岁，有无数的机会，平平波波的是日夜，就算出错，从头来又如何？